About this particular topic, I have to very honestly and very sincerely say, who cares? Hello, welcome back to this series of 100 videos for 100 cantos of Dante's Divine Comedy. Today we are looking at Canto 29 of Dante's Paradiso, which is a canto that has a very strongly intellectual tone, not a lot of emotional intensity, so it might be a little bit more difficult to get into it in terms of us as common readers. We've been enjoying many cantos so far that are very intense, emotionally intense. This one, as I mentioned briefly in the previous video about Canto 28, is the very last one, the very last canto in the whole Divine Comedy that has a theological or doctrinal discourse in it. Right here we are in the ninth heaven, which is the Primum Mobile, and the last one, really, the last one of the entire huge onion before the Empyreum. So we are still in the ninth heaven, and Dante will talk to us about angels, their nature, their characteristics, and many different elements. Now, the intellectual tone of the canto is also demonstrated by Dante by the fact that he is using a structure, is following a structure to tell us about the angels, that is using a blueprint that was already existing in Dante's times in a book by Pietro Lombardo called Il Libro delle Sentenze, or the Book of Sentences, which was almost the most important textbook of students of theology in their universities. They would use this Book of Sentences by Pietro Lombardo, and in the chapter dedicated to angels, Pietro Lombardo would follow a structure in an order that Dante is following here in Canto 29. So very much in line with the intellectual tone of the canto, the initial four tercets include a very elaborate opening simile that needs to be a little bit unpacked. Now, we know that the children of Latona were Apollo and Diana, so the sun and the moon. So we know Dante is talking about the sun and the moon in the first line. Then Dante mentions the ram and the scales, so the constellation of the Aries and the constellation of the Libra, which are at diametrically opposed points in the circle of the zodiac. This very beautiful and sophisticated astrological image is described by Mandelbaum, whose translation in English I'm reading here, as follows. When the sun is in Aries and the moon in Libra, or vice versa, one planet rises while the other sets at opposing points on the horizon. To the observer, the half disk of the rising moon and that of the setting sun, the lower half of each disk being covered so that the horizon acts as a kind of belt, Dante uses the word belt twice, appear for a brief moment to hang in equilibrium from the zenith of the sky, like the pans of a balance. Then little by little they leave the belt of the horizon, one rising into the hemisphere above it and the other sinking into the hemisphere below. As always with the most complicated similes by Dante, different Dante scholars have actually different opinions about why Dante has created this complicated simile. But there are some ideas, and I think they all make sense. First of all, the first one that I read among many scholars is that this stands to signify this moment of passage between the material world and the completely spiritual world. That's where we are. We are still in the ninth heaven, and therefore in equilibrium, in balance between materiality and pure spirituality. The second interpretation or level of meaning, if we want, it's a very interesting one, a very interesting interpretation, and we could understand this simile as if to remind us of the history of the angels that Dante will give us later on in the canto. And so while they were in equilibrium, all of them at creation, because they were all created at the same time, then we had some of them who followed Lucifer and went down down below, and the majority of them remained in the upper hemisphere and obviously in the heavens. So it's not sure that this was part of Dante's plan, but it sounds plausible. It really sounds plausible. And third interpretation, somebody also said that this moment could also signify that moment of balance, or the brief moment between the moment of the angels' creation and the moment when the angels made their first important choice. Again, when Lucifer sinned of pride against God, and so he fell. But that moment of, let's call it, equilibrium in between the creation of angels and that fatal moment for the angels who fell. The entire canto, from line 10, where Dante says "Poi cominciò, io dico e non dimando," the entire canto is Beatrice's monologue. She is speaking to Dante about the angels. She is, as very often she's done before, reading his questions in his heart, and so he doesn't need to express them because she understands them, and she provides her answers all about the angels, which very often today is a topic, that of the angels, that is brought up almost as a joke to signify something that there's nothing more boring than the talking about the sex of the angels, or even more, let's say, unproductive and useless than talking about doctrine that has to do with angels. Personally, I'm not too fascinated by angels, even as a Catholic, but I do see the importance of studying the angel. The discipline is called Angelology. I do see that importance of the discipline because within the scriptures, the angels appear and are mentioned many times. They are a very ancient type of concept and character. They existed even in Aristotle's writings as the second mover, because the first mover obviously was God in Aristotle's writings, but something like demons or angels were the secondary movers, and they were then incorporated into Christianity. They seem to be important, especially to better understand the nature of God, because within the scriptures we read about the commands that God gives to his angels. We read about the actions, the behaviors of the angels, and by analyzing that, by studying that, we can better understand God. And even just by this particular characteristic of the angels, I see some value. We also need to consider that in this canto, while Beatrice is speaking specifically about angels, it's pretty clear, and this is kind of accepted among all Dante's commentators, that this is also Dante talking about mankind in general and all creatures, the spiritual ones, they are the angels, but also human creatures. Because in between lines 13 and 18, for example, where Beatrice talks to Dante about the creation of angels, she also is at the same time talking about the reason for all of creation by God. So she's referring directly to Genesis. So the theological questions that Dante is trying to address in this canto are in fact extremely profound. Question number 1: why did God create angels? And as a corollary, why did God create anything at all? The answer is beautiful, poetic. Genesis, as an ancient book, doesn't really give us that answer. Genesis only tells us that God created and how and when, etc. But it doesn't give us the why. The why has been elaborated by doctrine throughout history. And Dante reflects that. So he says, perché suo splendore potesse risplendendo dir subsisto. There is this reflection of shining, of the life and the splendor of God that reflects into the creatures so that they can say subsisto, or I exist, or I am. And it's very beautiful how it says, come i piacque saperse in nuovi amori l'eterno amore. L'eterno amore, the eternal love, saperse, opened up, in nuovi amori, in new loves. You can almost see a flower bloom with this description. The flower that keeps blooming and showing new petals, new fresh petals. This is the visual description of creation. If God is omnipotent, eternal, and has no needs, why did he bother to create anything at all? This is also a theological question. And generally, the answer is love. God's creation is driven by his desire to see his love reflected in other loves. Second question, what was God doing before creation? Another very profound theological question. And the answer starts at line 19. Né prima quasi torpente si giacque, che né prima né poscia procedette lo discorrere di Dio sovra quest'acque. There is here a very erudite, and is it erudite or erudite? Please help me here. Quote or allusion to Genesis book 1, where the divine spirit is described as almost floating above the waters. And this is a very interesting part of Genesis. What are these waters? Of course, the waters of the earth, but also back in antiquity, the Primum Mobile was called with another name, the aqueous heaven, or the water heaven. So this explains why Dante says sovra queste acque, which means above these waters, meaning this, where we are, in the ninth heaven, in the Primum Mobile. Mandelbaum's translation is upon these waters, in fact. And so you should wonder, why is Beatrice saying these waters if there's no waters around them? It's actually because the Primum Mobile was considered as made of a certain watery substance that was transparent. The answer to this theological question is that clearly God was not simply lazily lying on his sofa and watching TV and doing nothing. This is what torpente means, meaning lazily. But the answer is that there was no time. So it doesn't make sense to ask what was happening before creation. Here we can in fact sense something that is very similar conceptually to something like the Big Bang. And the concept, we go back to the relationship between science and religion, or science and faith. The concept that the universe has been created by the Big Bang from a scientific point of view, but at the same time is constantly created by God in every moment of eternity, is something that is can be reconciled together, can be reconciled, and instead of being in conflict, these two concepts can actually coexist. Dante's third theological question is more technical, because he wants to know, and we understand this only by Beatrice's answer, he wants to know the how. How did God go about creation? And the answer comes, of course, from ancient philosophy that Beatrice summarizes so well. She says form and matter, both separate and also united in themselves. This is why he's mentioning this kind of three arrows, because one arrow is form by itself, the other arrow is matter by itself, or the raw material, and the third arrow is the union of form and matter that is indissoluble. So we have pure form, which is the angelic intelligence, number one. We have the raw material, number two, and all creation and all the heavens, which are the mix, the union of the two. The tercet at line 25 is fascinating. I find it really fascinating because it's reflecting directly the almost scientific theory of light that has been valid up to Galileo's time and even beyond. Because with this tercet and the next one, Dante is telling us that what they used to believe, that scientifically light traveled at an infinite speed. Of course, today we know that's not true, but it took a long while for science to understand properly understand the speed of light. And so this is why here Dante says, so did the three, form, matter, and the union, flash into being from the Lord with no distinction in beginning, all at once. It's beautiful as a ray shines into amber, crystal, or glass, so that there is no interval between its coming and it's lighting at all. Everything is, because the speed is infinite, therefore light, let's say, propagates all everywhere at the same time. It looks like that, but we know that it's not like that. Then, together with form and matter, God created order and pattern. It's really, really beautiful here how the word that Dante uses to indicate pattern. The word is costrutto at line 30. He says costrutto, which is clearly a metaphor because it's a word that means the syntaxis of the grammatic syntaxis of a sentence in Italian. So it's clearly indicating that God created order, and then the costrutto, or in other words, everything that is connecting things together in different ways to bring up meaning from whatever is being created. At line 32 and 33, Dante is explaining how the creation included all the highest things, the empyreum, the lowest things of creation, line 34, the pure potentiality that possess the lowest part. This is obviously the earth, and then in the middle, the potentiality of the middle is all this area between the earth and empyreum, all the heavens that are in the middle between the lowest creation, the raw materials, and the highest heavens. It's now the turn of Saint Jerome to be slapped by Beatrice, because he wrote that angels were created many centuries before the heavens and the earth. But Beatrice here clarifies to Dante that is not true, that is a mistake, and she uses as justifications A, the scriptures, and B, reason, because it's with reason or logic that you can understand that if they existed before the heavens and the earth, what were they doing? Since their purpose is to make all the heavens work, etc., they had no purpose before it. So it doesn't make sense that they existed before. This is the logic behind it. Line 49 is also really fascinating because Dante tries to give a sense of the temporality that went between the creation of the angels to the moment of the fall of Lucifer and his gang, let's say. And he says, sooner than it takes to count to 20, this happened. A portion of the angels fell and disturbed the lowest elements. They fell into the earth and created hell. Between line 70 and line 82 or 81, Beatrice touches on what seems to be a very irrelevant theological point, and I don't even see why it would be important for Dante to dedicate 10 lines of his Divine Comedy to this point. The point is, the question is, can angels remember or can they not? Obviously, this was one of the various diatribes that you could find in the scholastic universities in his times, in the theology universities. But about this particular topic, I have to very honestly and very sincerely say, who cares? From here, we can say that the second part of the canto starts from line more or less 85. The second part is less high, also in language, and many commentators have been critical towards Dante to say, oh no, there's too much discrepancy, it's too different, the language he uses in the first part is so elevated, so Latin, high, and the second part is really too low. But first of all, who wants to really criticize Dante? And second, it makes sense because he wants to give us the discrepancy between what actually happened in the heavens and with creation, those high topics, and what happened in reality on earth. In the second part, there is a little bit of polemic that Beatrice is doing in criticizing the religious people and the pastors who are really propagating some bad theology among all their sheep or among the Christians. So Beatrice criticizes those masters or those pastors, or maybe even professors and teachers, who, line 89, quando è posposta la Divina Scrittura o quando è torta, when the Divine Scripture is perverted, they don't understand it or they just explain it wrongly, or posposta, which means it's put in a secondary position compared to other masters like Aristotle, like Averroes, and some teachers did that. To answer a question, they would start from Aristotle this is what Dante wants to say here. Another theological dispute had come out because in the Gospel we read that in the moment of the death of Jesus, the sun was darkened. So a lot of questions, a lot of diatribes. What exactly did that mean? What happened? Was there an eclipse? What happened there? And Dante is saying che la luce si nascose da sé. So Beatrice is clarifying to Dante that this darkening of the sun happened as a miracle by itself. The sun itself, as a miracle, simply lowered or dimmed its own light, instead of what was believed by many until then, until Dante's times, that in fact another miracle happened, and this miracle was the moon, like Mandelbaum says here, moving back along the zodiac, kind of retracing its own course, so as to interpose itself in front of the sun. That was kind of a complicated miracle. If it's a miracle, let's just do it properly and directly, no? According to Beatrice, this is also demonstrated by the fact that not only the Jews, but also the Spaniards and the Indians too saw that eclipse. So it wouldn't make sense that everybody in the world saw the eclipse, because they knew that the eclipse was a geographically limited phenomenon. Canto 29 concludes with a fairly long invective by Beatrice against pastors or priests or religious people who do a lot of damages, not only asking for these indulgences, asking for money for their powers, which was really the treacherous behavior, the fraudulent behavior of the clergy, but also the pastors who, even sometimes in good faith, that don't understand properly the scriptures, and therefore they preach something that is wrong, and that confuses the Christians, the folk, or the sheep, like he talks here. But even in Paradiso, Canto 5, line 80, Dante had said, "Non siate pecore matte," which means, yes, it's okay to be sheep of the shepherd or of the pastor, but don't be completely irrational as to not think with your own head. You have to look into theology yourself. You have a responsibility, in other words, as a Christian, to make your own research and your studies and understand what your pastor is talking about. The monks of the Order of St. Anthony, for example, are targeted by Beatrice as well. The fact that she says to fatten their pigs and others to more piggish still is because they were famous for having pigs. So it's not really a metaphor here, but when he says others too more piggish, is referring again to those ones who are exchanging money for indulgences and for spiritual benefits. Line 130. Questa natura sì oltre s'ingrada in numero che mai non fu loquela né concetto mortal che tanto vada. Once again, like Dante did in Canto 28, he goes back to the enormous number of angels in the heaven. It was fascinating how in Canto 28 he picked up on the ancient fable or example of the chessboard, which is an example that comes from probably Persian folklore, and you have the exponential multiplication of the little seed of wheat on the chessboard to just signify the enormous number of angels in the heavens. In any case, even if the language has a little bit of a curve downward in the second part of the canto, you can notice how in the last at least 4 tercet it comes back up. In fact, Dante manages to raise the level of his language again after verse 133 or 136, and widening up the scope or the theme of what Beatrice is referring to, because again she is saying the intensity of love, sweetness appears unequally, and she's explaining, like she has before for the blessed souls, that God's love is the same one for everybody in the heavens, only there is a differentiation by role and responsibility. This is all I have to say about Canto 29, a canto that I would imagine somebody does not enjoy or like maybe as much as many others, but we know that Canto 33 is coming very soon. what the prayer to Mary in Canto 33, said T.S. Eliot, is the highest peak of Western poetry. That in itself is making us look forward to getting there. But all the coming cantos are just beautiful and wonderful. So thank you very much for watching this video. I'll see you next with Canto 30.